Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Today with me is Daniel McAdams, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Prosperity and also the co-host of this program. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Good to have you here today. I don't know whether you saw it, but I visited Washington, D.C. this past weekend. And of course, today being the President's Day, there were a few things that came up at this conference, which was held by Students for Liberty as well as Young Americans for Liberty. And it was pretty well attended. Did you see anything in the news about our little event up there?
I did. I'm surprised they were able to drag you back to Washington after that. But I was following the different tweets from the young people who were there, and there was so much excitement. You know, one fellow was so tickled, he said, "I can't believe I'm about to shake Ron Paul's hand." So from what I could see, it was pretty well attended.
I responded by saying, "Big deal." Yes. No, the young people are certainly very receptive. And this was an audience that came from two different groups. There's the Young Americans for Liberty as well as Students for Liberties. And they bring young people together, but the young people come together because they're starved for information about what individual liberty is all about. And the two groups have some variations in policy, but the young people are just seem to be unified because they have this desire and eagerness to understand what liberty is all about. And of course, on the stage with me was Judge Napolitano, who's a good friend. But I imagine it was a common question they ask under those circumstances, but the host, Nick Gillespie from Reason, asked me, who was my favorite president? And guess whose name popped into my mind? Grover Cleveland. He's been a favorite of mine, and somebody I'm sure you know a little bit about in history on Grover Cleveland.
Yeah, he was actually very good on foreign policy as well as domestic policy, actually. And
yeah, and you know, when I was mentioning his name, they asked me why, and I said, well, all I know is he vetoed a lot of bills, and that's my kind of president, and he certainly did. But Judge Napolitano added, which I thought was a very pertinent statement. He said, you know, Ron, he says also he's the last president that we had that vetoed a bill for constitutional reasons. So that's what, over 100 years?
115 years ago.
115 years and not a president. Yeah, we've had vetoes, but it was all for special interest groups, or, you know, you're not giving me enough power to run the world, and you're not giving me enough money to do this. So yeah, the veto was used properly. I remember one of his famous vetoes was he was vetoing special aid to Texas. You know, that would have been really a tough one because they had a bad drought here, and the federal government was going to bail them out, and he said, no way. But the presidents are interesting because I don't know exactly which grade school and high school you went to, but I know the schools I went to, as most Americans have been taught, who the great presidents are. Well, you know, maybe Lincoln and Wilson and Roosevelt and LBJ, and inevitably they're associated with war.
Yeah. Strong presidents.
But there is a libertarian friend that we have that wrote a book a few years ago, and he wanted to sort that out and challenge the conventional wisdom. And that book was written by Ivan Elan.
Yes.
And his book, Recarving Rushmore. And the interesting thing here is he's ranking the presidents on, guess what? Peace and prosperity. Sounds like a friend. And liberty. But he comes up with new names and different names. And of course, Grover Cleveland is in that name.
Top tier.
And he's right there. But do you recall anything in particular that is associated with Grover Cleveland on foreign policy?
Well, you know, Ivan's book is great because it just gives you a little chapter on each president. He breaks it down so well, and it's always been a favorite in my family, and I know you've enjoyed it so much too. But the thing that he points out about Grover Cleveland was not only was he good on the economics, but he was good on foreign policy. He restrained a lot of the interventionist impulse that was going pretty hot and heavy at the end of the 19th century. You know, there was big support for the annexation of Hawaii at the time, and there was a U.S.-backed coup against the king. And he was completely against that and spoke out against it, and probably irritated a lot of special interests by doing so. He also resisted congressional, this is a good one that you'll appreciate, he resisted congressional pressure to get involved with the conflict between Cuba and Spain at the time. So what a turnaround that is from resisting the pressure.
Well, we knew he vetoed bills on the basic principle of the Constitution. He didn't like foreign intervention, but then again, he had a special interest in monetary policy. He was a gold standard person, probably the last true president that really believed in the gold standard. But he didn't have to deal with a central bank, but I'm sure he'd be opposed, to the central bank. But he was at the time McKinley was there, and of course they debated the issue too. But the gold standard, he was well identified with the gold standard. But an interesting little story is that during the presidential campaigns, I was in and out of New Hampshire, and somebody had whispered in me, "Do you know that Grover Cleveland's grandson lives in the area?" And I said, "Boy, I'd like to meet him." So the next time I came through, they had scheduled a meeting, just a private meeting with the grandson, and so we had about an hour visit and talk. And he told me a lot about family history too, but he brought to me, and as a gift, was a political pin with the name was just Cleveland, and it was gold plated, of course. It looked like real gold, and so he gave me that, and I have that framed in my house because it sort of has historic significance of Grover Cleveland. But the other parts of the meeting in Washington, the convention, foreign policy did come up a lot. And that's where maybe there are some subtle but not outrageous disagreements between some people, but that is how much intervention there should be. And of course, I took my usual position, but some sort of use the argument of the humanitarian instincts that maybe, when a lot of people are getting killed, don't you think there's a time that we have to do this? And instead of me arguing a purely moral reason or purely constitutional reason why we shouldn't get involved, which should be enough, I used the practical argument. I said, what good does it do? Take a look at the last 25 years. Why can't the last 25 years be a strong defense of our position? Where have we intervened for humanitarian reasons, which is always an excuse for the military-industrial complex and for others? But whether you go to Libya or Egypt or Afghanistan or now Ukraine, they were a few people were there were sort of sympathetic. You got to go in there and help the good guys in there, and they wanted to just use this as an example instead of me becoming not pro one side because I wouldn't defend their position. They say, "Oh, that means you have to be pro Russia and pro Putin." Of course, I think you saw my answer to that.
Pro fact.
I'm pro fact. I'm neither pro Russian, and that's what our policy should be. It's sort of non-interventionism is quite a bit different.
And it's really critical to libertarianism. I mean, there is a small strain in libertarianism that says we have to export liberty by hook or by crook, by whatever means. And it's the impulse toward interventionism that's the problem, because it presumes that you know what's best for other people. And that's the slippery slope you start going down, and it always will end up in conflict and war. So I think it's really and you've always talked about this, it's such a critical component of freedom, liberty, and libertarianism is to not intervene regardless of how strong that impulse is.
Yeah, it may start off well-intended, we're going to do good, and then it morphs into something else because they have violated the basic principle, and you use the right word. They want to do this through force. So once you're using force to do good, then it gets out of control. And I remember one of the individuals, writers, authors that came to our office for a session for the Liberty Committee was Klaus Wren. And Klaus was an expert on the French Revolution and the Jacobins, and he has a book, and he used the term neo-Jacobins. And so even if the leaders of our intervention in the Middle East had sinister motives, I think the majority of the people even those who want to go to Ukraine. Now, they have believed the propaganda, they're going for the good reasons, but then, of course, Ren's argument was look at what happened in France.
Yes.
You know, hardly a good example for justifying, you know, the use of force.
And the other thing is the people that argue in places like Ukraine, they argue for foreigners to get out, but they never argue for the U.S. to get out. And that's a point you made at the conference, is that you said, I agree that all of these foreign militaries should get out, but that includes the U.S. too.
Well, isn't the recent token effort at a peace agreement between the two sides right now that's one of their planks, is get the foreign governments out, but that they're not including the United States.
Well, the president has a plan next month to send 600 paratroopers, U.S. active military, into Ukraine to start training the military. And as I read the agreement, that was point 10 of the agreement, that all foreign troops need to leave. And that seems to me, at least, to be, in the spirit of the agreement, a violation to send U.S. troops in.
You know, one other question that came up was, what example would you have to set a standard for the type of government we have? Realizing that not too many people would jump up and down and say, well, we immediately have to follow this country. But I like to use the presidency of Switzerland, which they don't have. They essentially don't have a president. And yet they have a defense. You know, it's the individuals are defended, and they say, oh yeah, but that makes you vulnerable. How vulnerable were they in World War I or World War II? They don't send troops around the world. So maybe we could learn a lesson from that. But anyway, I want to go to another subject, because on my way back home yesterday on the plane, I had a Washington Post, and there was an article on there, and it had to do with inflation, and that caught my attention. And the title to this was "Inflation is Dead." And the theory was that some prices, oil prices are going down, so that has killed off inflation. And the real irony of this whole article was that inflation was dead because prices were going down, never mentions the money supply, never mentions the price of money or the price of bonds or the price of stocks, but he says there's only one problem, it's these financial bubbles. So I wonder where he thought the financial bubbles were coming from. so that's, this to me is repetitive all the time. And it made me, this whole thing about inflation being dead and not understanding it, because inflation comes from the Federal Reserve. When they print too much money, they lower the interest rates, cause distortions, causes bubbles that have to be corrected by the market. But they're capable of inflating endlessly, and they are, and all the statistics show this. But it reminded me of Mark Twain's a quote about when he read in the paper that he had already died. But he claimed that the reports of his death were grossly exaggerated. So I would think the reports that inflation is dead have been greatly exaggerated, and the day will come that this will have to be admitted to. And I think you had mentioned that you know, the need to inflate has a lot to do, you know, with fighting these wars and the spending, you know, on the budget.
Absolutely, it's a way to hide the great cost of these wars.
Yeah, they can do that, because if they had to do the direct taxation, they couldn't do it. But I think the foreign policy is a big issue. What you're doing in the Institute, I think, is just fantastic. We still have a lot of work to do to convert the people, but believe me, you should be encouraged, because a lot of young people that I met on this weekend are like the young people I've been meeting. And when they ask me at the convention, what do you think it is that brings a lot of young people out to hear what you're saying? And I said the foreign policy has been a really big issue. Of course, they're interested in civil liberties too. I think young people like to be left alone. So
I was going to ask you what was maybe your biggest applause line when you were there.
well, it was the biggest laugh anyway, but I think it was an applause type laugh, and that is when they asked me, what are they really interested in? I said, they want their freedom, they want their freedom of choice, and a lot of people want the right to drink raw milk, and I think smoke whatever they want. But that principle is there. It's a principle of freedom of choice and making these decisions. So.
And liberty brings people together, as you've always said. These two groups would probably possibly have nothing other in common. But
yeah, and I really challenge those to listen carefully to you know, the issues, because and the burden will be on those young people and that age group, because these wars, and you've written about this and quoted me as saying, you know, these wars aren't going to go away, or they could go away if the people rose up and said to the Congress not to do it. But the other option is that we'll run out of money, and that's usually what happened. That's when the Soviet Empire collapsed, and that could happen to us. But a lot of people haven't even recognized the American empire at all, so they might not quite understand that yet.
Well, if they looked at what happened to the standard of living in the Soviets after it collapsed, they would be a little bit more frightened about the possibility.
Well, anyway, I want to thank everybody for joining in today to the Ron Paul Liberty Report on President's Day, and come back soon.